do was organize this open news meeting around those big stories. I've sort of handpicked 5 of them that I think get to big ideas that Tortoise should really see as vital to understanding what drives the news and trying to tell better stories about Meta and the other tech states going forward. Those stories, just briefly to characterize them, it begins with the banning of former President Donald Trump, a decision taken by the Facebook Oversight Board. And I'd like to possibly talk also about their strategy for moderating the Taliban in Afghanistan. Both of those issues get to the question of freedom of expression, and hopefully I'll be joined by my colleague Matt Dancona, who will maybe help us think through some of the implications for the online safety bill. I'd love to talk about Project Jedi Blue, which is the alleged collusion with Google by Facebook over advertising, and the general issue of monopoly power, which is a very common criticism of Facebook Meta platforms as such a large market player. I'd definitely like to talk about the metaverse, not least because that video is so interesting, but because I think there is a big emerging trend in technology to join up digital worlds, and it raises all sorts of questions around how to moderate content that appears there, what's real, what's not, how that will affect our approach to democracy, to authentic content, to ownership, and to our own sense of self. I'd love to talk about climate misinformation, which a recent report, we ran a story just last week about the issue of narratives that undermine climate action. And with my colleagues at Tortoise returning from COP, I hope we'll have some ideas on that. And finally, to perhaps examine the issue of self-harm and harmful but legal content on Facebook's main sort of image sharing platform, Instagram, as well as possibly to talk about their plans to deliver that platform to children in the form of Instagram for Kids. So there's a huge amount there. And I think we'll just have to see how much we can get through, because I'd also love to hear from everybody in the room, not just my colleagues. Love to know what you think. So please do get involved. My colleague Patricia is in the chat and will be on the lookout for ideas. We would love to, I say we, my co-author on the Tech State Sense Maker, Alexi Mostras, and I would love to come away with a sense of what to look out for going into next year, and the ways in which we can take our investigations forward and report further on the tech states. We've all got Facebook accounts. At least we all know people that do. Almost all of us have used Instagram or encountered it. Same goes for WhatsApp. We've all been served ads that rely on Facebook's data, and we're all affected by the way in which their platform shapes opinion. So if I could, I'd love to start with the banning of former President Trump and the decision that was taken by the Facebook Oversight Board to keep him off the platform for at least 2 years, or until the threat of his inciting content and speech had diminished significantly. I'm told Matt is on the call, and if we could go to him first, just for his view on that decision looking back now, and possibly also how it pertains to protecting future actors in the political world and elsewhere. I know you're very interested, Matt, in what this means for journalism, the behavior that Facebook might be taking in the future. And if you could tell us a bit about your engagement with the online safety bill, which is gonna have an effect on this stuff.
Thanks, Nick. Well, on the question of Trump, it was perhaps a necessary step, but a very bad precedent. So what you had was a situation where, if we think back to those days in January, they already seem a long time ago, you had a still incumbent president who was inciting a coup. If I was watching the very good iPlayer documentary on the January the 6th raid on the Capitol, and it's salutary to go back and look and see how how lethal it was. There were people who were definitely trying to get into the Capitol and kill Mike Pence, the vice president, and Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, because they were engaged in certifying the presidential election, which the rioters believed had been stolen. And unquestionably, whatever the outcome of the second impeachment of Donald Trump, the president was engaged in incitement. So Twitter had to make a call, and it made a big call, which was to ban Trump from Twitter. The problem with this is that it now sets a precedent, which basically makes the decision makers at Twitter the kind of biggest regulators in the world, and I've never thought that's ideal. I'm not a great fan of setting up a ministry of truth in every country either, but I do think that we need to have legislation that maps onto the reality of the world in which we live. And notoriously, legislators are bad at keeping pace with technology. And in the case of the tech states, they've become, our legislators are like the Amish, trying to work out what to do with iPhones. They just have no idea, really. To give a very good example, the 2016 Brexit referendum was overseen in terms of law by an act that was passed in 2000, 4 years before Facebook even existed. And it was blind to social media and therefore of absolutely no use in the subsequent issues that arose about the propriety of the Vote Leave side, and indeed leave.eu. So I'm very much in favour of the online harms bill, online safety bill that's being drafted and worked on right now. My part is very small. I gave evidence to the committee that's overseeing the legislation. And I came away with a very clear sense that there's a lot more work to do, particularly around what constitutes harm, because, of course, the sheer scale of social media, the sheer scale of content that we're dealing with here is completely unprecedented in history. So what you do with it is very hard for people who've essentially been raised on the printed page or the television and the radio to deal with. And I think that what they're trying to do is work out a balance between an old-fashioned approach to harm, which is just incitement to violence, and a more modern approach to harm, which takes some account of psychological trauma and so on. But the language they've got in the bill at the moment is far too wide. It refers to psychological effects, and really it could capture people who were, let's say, offended by a passage in a work of fiction. And no one wants that. There are also huge problems around which kinds of speech should be protected, which kinds of content should be protected. At the moment, the bill aspires to protect journalism, very loosely understood. But of course, what journalism is nowadays is very hard to define. For example, Twitter threads are becoming, a pretty good competitor to old-fashioned political columns, and often they are, more pithy and more useful. Are they protected? I mean, the law, as presently drafted, doesn't say. So we need to take account of that. We need to be very clear on what journalism is, and indeed which, how much of it deserves special protection, whether indeed there should be a hierarchy of speech, which is not something that you have in First Amendment law in the United States. The general approach that I came away with being drawn to was that we shouldn't try and legislate perfectly first. We should have a lean, mean first bill that goes through during 2022 and tries to deal with some of the more egregious issues on which we can all agree. We're going to talk about self-harm and so on. I think, things like that, sites that encourage suicidality, terrorism, and so on. And then, as used to be the case with the Prevention of Terrorism Act, Parliament every year calendrically returns to the bill as a matter of necessity. It needs to renew the bill. I think this is good on two levels. First of all, I think it's absolutely essential that every parliamentarian feels that knowing about what all this is about is part of what it is to be an MP. It's not just something you do once every 5 or 10 years and then forget about it. This is, absolutely at the heart of what citizenship is, society is, business is, democracy is. So it's a good practice for MPs every year to have to reacquaint themselves with it. And secondly, doing it on a sort of annual iterative basis will mean that we'll very quickly be able to find out what's going right, what's working, deal with the tech companies themselves and collaborate and cooperate with them and say, what are you learning? Because the certain thing is they'll be learning more than government will be.
Yeah.
And unless we have a collaborative approach, I think, with the tech companies, we'll get nowhere because the technology will move so fast. It will achieve what they call jurisprudential escape, which is just a fancy way of saying the technology just leaps over the law, and the law is 5 years behind, which is at the moment, if only it was 5 years behind, it's 10 or 15 years behind.
Yeah.
So it's that my general feeling is that we need to get something on the statute books as soon as possible and then come back to it as soon as possible too.
So there was something you said at the top there, Matt, that I think is really interesting. It was a good decision in the moment, but set a bad precedent. Going forward, when we're thinking about Twitter, we're thinking about Facebook's app, now obviously owned by Meta Platforms, their approach in the future to big political figures is going to be, at least in part, in the shadow of that decision around Trump. It was the first of its kind. Just in brief, like what are you apprehensive about in terms of that bad precedent then? Is it simply that there will be a trend towards more and more willingness to deplatform political leaders? I
mean, you have to remember how ancient I am, Luke. I mean, I'm a product of the Cold War, when free expression was a good thing. And I am nervous of precedents that will enable future shutting down of debate.
Right.
In a way, what I worry about is less that Bolsonaro is going to have his Twitter account frozen than that someone who's just making a perfectly legitimate point, which may upset some people, but is well within the boundaries of legal and accepted speech, is kicked off Twitter simply for commercial reasons. Now, it's a tricky one because there's no right to a platform on a commercial platform like Twitter or Facebook. No one has a right to it. But at the same time, in terms of our culture, I don't think we want to live in a world where people are being kicked off social platforms as a matter of course. This should be something that happens to, the bad faith actors, the people who are really going in there to cause trouble. And there are plenty of them. I mean, I'm glad there are rules and self-regulations, by the way. I don't believe for a minute in absolutist free speech. But I do worry that the sort of the big Monty Python foot coming down on Trump's head was a bad signal in the sense that it was absolutely right. And I again, to repeat, I don't think Twitter had much of a choice. But it also then spins into a world where, and you can see it on Twitter, people, the first response often in exchanges is that, you should be kicked off Twitter, which is unhealthy in a society where we're trying to breed out polarization and division and divisiveness. So that's my 10 cents.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Matt. There was another thing that you said there about just the volume of content being absolutely unheard of. And I want to pick up on that in a sec, possibly with my colleague Nimo, just because we had a chat about it a moment ago. But so I guess for us as reporters, Facebook's decision to suspend Trump or ban him for 2 years until the kind of risk assessment changes, it will elapse pretty soon. So I suppose we need to look out for the reasoning and justifications and what's made public around Facebook's decision, per the advice of the oversight board, in theory, to either let his account resume or not, which will certainly be interesting. So there was another story that was a few weeks into our reporting on Tech States that was about a post that had been wrongfully moderated. And it suggested that the Prime Minister Modi of India was inciting genocide against the Sikh population of India through association with a Hindu nationalist group that had been responsible for similar crimes back in the 1980s. And the failure of Facebook's policy, it was eventually suggested by the oversight board, was that they didn't understand the context of the post. And Nimo, we were talking about the issue that big platforms have when they're trying to be global in their users, but can't really be that way in terms of their expertise.
Yeah, so I think that the main thing I said, and the first thing I said to you was just like in quite an exasperated voice, like it's just too big. Like I think that basically, I don't think it's physically, humanly possible to have enough moderators to understand the nuances and the cultural sensitivities, the cultural specificities, the language, like barriers. Obviously, Facebook is like, based in America, it's English first. To understand the context and content of every single post that is made in every corner of the world. I don't see how that is in any way humanly possible. There are already so many issues with moderation anyway, with all these reports coming out about them outsourcing moderation to people who are being overworked and underpaid, and they're not comping them for psychological help after seeing like all kinds of awful posts online. I just think that the sheer volume of posts from all corners of the world, I don't understand how any one company could ever employ enough people to make sure that even a fraction of those posts were without either censoring people needlessly or it being a free-for-all effectively. Yeah, that's all.
Very difficult to be a sort of master of the universe in that sense. Every language, every dialect, every cultural nuance. I think there's probably something in the idea of following not only the outsourcing of moderation that you mentioned, but also what Meta platforms and other social media sites say about how they're trying to tackle the issue of sort of regional specificity, I suppose you could call it. Thanks, Nimo. I'm conscious Robert has had his hand up since the top, so I would love to hear what he had to say, particularly if it's sort of related to the idea of banning Trump or what we started with at the top. And then it would be great to maybe migrate to one of the other stories we mentioned. Robert, what are you thinking?
So there are a couple of things. In particular, just the sheer scale of the advancement of technology tends to worry me, and I really like Matthew's view about working in collaboration with the platforms and the technologists. If they are to be seen to be anything other than maleficent, then they need to start working with society in a way that allows them to try and give us advance warning of technologies that they've been using so that we can build legislation around stuff that is coming, not just that has been. And I certainly remember in the times when I first started in working on IT and user-generated content, thinking about things that, well, nobody's going to want that. Nobody's going to want a little icon at the bottom of the screen to show me whether John is online today or not. But in fact, that's kind of like trivial these days. And it's just the way in which we cannot anticipate what's going to come if we don't sit with the technologists and the tech bros and say, what are you doing? How do we build safety measures around that? And it's a constant process. It can't be individual, that's for sure. And the second thing on the sheer volume of content, it just struck me then that in the early days of email and spam adoption, email adoption and the overwhelming nature of spam, I can remember trying to support several companies, a law firm in particular, who wanted their IT team to look at every single email with an attachment and decide whether that was should they let in the company or not?
Mm.
And that was the beginning of spam. And now, of course, we've got Bayesian filters and AI doing most of that work for us, which is exceptionally good. And I can see the only way to deal with the bad content or the unwanted content is to have some sort of algorithm, AI type content mechanism to help control that. And specifically, I'd say in a way that allows us as users to moderate it as much as the moderators of the platform itself. So give people some agency within that to be able to control it, certainly at a gross level as well as locally.
Can I, Robert, just circling back to the first point you made about collaboration, what incentivizes the tech companies into that relationship? If I'm a Microsoft or an Amazon, and I have what I think is a sort of first mover advantage in the deployment of a technology that I perhaps know is actually poorly understood by regulators and maybe even poorly understood by my competitors, why would I go to the table to talk about legislation that would potentially sort of constrain the deployment of that technology?
I wouldn't say, I would talk not about constraint, but actually enabling. So if we use regulation to enable those technologies to be used, and that kind of weeds out the issue of this can be used for bad purposes. So we want to build in mechanisms that stop that, unless that's what you want to do, in which case they're not going to come to you to talk to you anyway. But if they are genuinely trying to add facilities and features to their platform that they believe we as users would want and aren't society wrecking, then they should be working with regulators to build safeguards for them and us as users. So within the legislation. And you have the ultimate sanction of saying, well, we'll pull the plug on you if you don't.
Yeah, I've got a note here that says, where's the coalition that will come to the table to nuance regulation as it goes forward? And I think that was, at least in part, the question raised by what Matt said. Thanks a lot, Robert. Lisa, you've got your hand up as well. I'd love to come to you if you've got something to say about what's just going on. Hello.
Hi, I apologize for the noise. I'm in a hotel. I'm at work. I'm traveling and I'm in a hotel. So the noise is bad. Thank you. Yeah, there was something that Matt D'Ancona said that resonated with me, and that was the jurisprudence point. This is an international jurisprudence issue. And I feel that I actually live in Asia most of the time. I've spent most of my life living in different countries, speaking different languages, and I get very frustrated with the way people are tackling this from a very kind of Northern European, North American hegemony perspective. It was interesting, somebody said on the platform there about most of the moderators being English speaking. And I think what's happening is that these large organizations, which have more money and power and influence than actual nation states, see individual parliaments, individual activist groups, individual groups of journalists or small media, local national media organizations as little insects, the little insects trying to bite the skin of an enormous elephant. This cannot be tackled on a nation by nation basis. This has to be an international effort. And I firmly believe that the fourth estate, journalists, people like James Harding setting up Tortoise, should be setting up something globally. This needs to be, journalists need to be looking at this by, the likes of yourself, talking to journalists in Myanmar, in India, in Russia, and saying, how can we cover this? How can we uncover what's happening? And how can we have an international sort of consensus on what the issues are? Because otherwise, it's just done on a piecemeal basis. And these guys are, to be honest, they're not bothering their shits about it. They're too big, they're too powerful, they're international. I really hope that journalists can get together and a really kind of proper international form of journalism. This is like war, sending correspondence to the war front. It's going to take an international effort to shine a light on some of the issues properly.
Right. Thank you so much. That's extremely interesting. I think that's a point that actually ranges across all of the various stories that we were sort of hoping to set out, the idea that nation by nation address. I mean, it's almost like the conceit of tech states in the first place. It's become too big to be within a nation, any given nation. I'd love to move, if we can, just conscious of time, onto this idea of the metaverse and a digital first experience of the world at large. And if I could, I go to James Wilson, one of my colleagues at Tortoise, because he's raised an interesting point that I haven't thought about before, about the digital economy. We've talked a little bit before about how you moderate content and some of the things that might crop up as we're sort of increasingly invested in a digital world. But what do you mean, or what's so interesting to you, James, about the idea of the digital economy in the metaverse?
I think that if you create this kind of digital world where anything is possible, then you're going to have to create means of buying and selling and trading things, right? And you can already see it with various different video games that people are gambling, you know, with loot boxes. I mean, people, they don't call it gambling in this country, but depending on the outcome of the white paper, which is coming up, it could be classified as such. And I kind of fear that there'll be so many in the next 10 years. There'll be the rise of different kinds of metaverses will give rise to different kind of payment systems within these worlds, and regulations that we won't be able to keep up with them. And companies will develop ways to hook people with kind of gambling addictions. There'll be possibly ways to kind of launder money through it, put funds in, take funds out. I'm far from an expert. I'm very much novice, but it's just something I'm interested in. I think it could lead to all kinds of potential pitfalls in the future.
Absolutely. Right.
And
so
the expert thing comes back. I mean, the fact that MPs just are not thinking about this when they come to regulating it is a huge issue. Yeah,
I'm actually reminded of something we did a little bit of work on a long time ago, and I think it's Robert's just put it in the chat. The Facebook Libra was a crypto token that the company proposed as a way of sort of democratizing finance to the world's unbanked. And there were concerns there, obviously, about what that meant for Facebook's sort of monopolization of people's engagement with life, I suppose. If your money's handled by Facebook, if your social interactions are handled by Facebook, does that sort of influence and control, mostly through their access to your data, just continue to expand? That's a really interesting question, Jane. I think essentially we need to be mindful of the relationship between cryptocurrencies and the metaverse, because like the physical world, there'll be an economy, and to all intents and purposes, it seems like that economy will be one at least in part related to cryptocurrency. Chris Chadwick has said, metaverses will surely take advantage of digital currencies. If we could go to Chris, that would be amazing. But just to stick with the idea of the metaverse in a sort of more general sense, one of the concerns that's been raised is that the types of content we have already in the online world that are harmful or extreme, they might become more so in a world where sort of there's this layered digital experience that you never really log out of, and you're experiencing it constantly through virtual reality or augmented reality headsets. And one of the dangers in that area, I think, or the dangerous areas of content, is pornography. Patricia, we had a little chat about this before the news meeting, and I wonder if I could just ask you, what do you think is the real danger to users, but also the real risk to people who are creating content of a world that is no longer just people interacting through computers, but sort of 10, 15, 20 hours a day in a virtual metaspace environment?
That is almost an impossible question to answer. Where do I even start? I mean, we were talking about this because I saw a statistic, and I can't find anything more recent, but from 2017, that was like 60% of VR websites used by people who own the headsets are pornography websites. And you enter, when you're moving from having something that people are viewing, and already there's a whole bunch of difficulty around the regulation of porn, which I could also go into. It's something that governments quite often don't want to touch because of the sort of stigma around porn and so on. But when you move it from that being a viewer experience to being an experience where you've got two individuals who are existing in a space, I mean, Seb put this in the chat earlier, how do you deal with consent? How do you deal with education? And then beyond that, how do you deal with the fact that people might become sort of addicted to it and constantly consuming it in a digital space, and what does that mean for people's mental health? There's such a broad range of issues when you talk about porn in the digital space and with Meta. And porn is already very far behind on regulation because of what I said earlier about the fact that it doesn't, people don't talk about it unless it's a sort of reactive thing, unless there's an agenda that they want to tick off. But yeah, is there anything more specific?
No, absolutely. I think it's something that we need to have on our agenda, isn't it, to be aware of as the technology that's supposedly going to make up the metaverse itself matures, whether it's AR and VR or it's the sort of web sites or online domains that you're spending your time in. As those things get more mature, we've got to be aware that it could lead to sort of intensification of use of the content forms like porn, and then the issues that you mentioned, addiction, abuse, problems of consent will become possibly become amplified. Zav, I've just read your comment and I'd love to bring you in. The idea of moderating more than just audio and text is an interesting one. What's your thought?
Yeah, I mean, it's just that Facebook is predominantly a text-based site, but I imagine the metaverse will be predominantly audio-based. And not only would you need to develop or to strengthen kind of existing algorithms which kind of recognize audio and can kind of dissect audio to understand nuance. But then you'll also need to, on top of that, account for the fact that, people will be speaking one of hundreds of different languages. And so if you don't have moderators who can be across all the different languages in which things are said or not said, then, I mean, for me, it just seems like it's an impossibly huge task for Facebook to moderate its sites as it is. I think when you add audio into that equation, and have audio as presumably the predominant medium through which people will communicate in the metaverse, it just seems, completely hopeless at the moment to understand how they'll get to a stage where they can kind of do that effectively.
Yeah. Tanishq has raised a point about issues of abuse, racist, sexist abuse, and possibly the problem also of anonymity around those types of abuse. So if you're there, Tanishq, it would be great to bring you in. But before we do that, there's a point around moderation that's not just to do with sort of harmful social content around pornography and body image and etc., but there's also one of climate misinformation, harmful content that relates to misinformation and disinformation. And this was something we reported on relatively recently in Tech States when we were in touch with an organization called Stop Funding Heat, who released a report showing that around sort of key events in the climate calendar of the past year, misinformation and climate denial on Facebook really spiked. So the meeting of world leaders in Cornwall, the publication of the IPCC's most recent finding reports that was really concerning with respect to the reality of reaching 1.5 degrees of warming. Staying below, 1.5 degrees of warming. And my colleague Phoebe's just come back from COP26, and I wondered if we could talk about the issue of climate misinformation, the fact that consumers and how they think are a key part of changing behavior. What's your kind of view on the issue there and how it's changing?
So I've dropped a link to that report, by the way, in the chat if you want to check it out. It's quite long and it's quite intense, but I've had a kind of a go through it. And I think, you know, it's about the narratives of climate misinformation are so interesting, just looking at like the way that it crosses over with so many spaces. And kind of the summary from the report is that, you know, there's a loss of misinformation. That's, you know, we could kind of expect that. It kind of leans into advertising, which is kind of what I was trying to say earlier in the chat about how it's a lot of English content that's being moderated, but it's also where the advertising in and kind of where those lines are. But in terms of being at COP, you know, I would say, you know, it's kind of a different situation to be in a city where there's lots of people who care about the climate. You know, you're pretty less likely to hear from the skeptics. But one of the things that me and Barney, colleague Barney working on Net Zero Sense Maker, went to a talk from which was framed slightly differently. It wasn't, you know, let's talk about EVs. It was talk about the history and the narrative of climate. And it was Yuval Harari, he's a historian, he was really interesting. And he kind of raised the issue that the bit where, you know, the youth activists have got it right. So, you know, Vanessa Nakate, Greta Thunberg is their narrative. And he framed it quite nicely, which is that, you know, no one goes to see a disaster, people go to see disaster films about volcano, or, you know, it's kind of headlined with what it is, or, you know, tsunami, you know, end of the world, Armageddon. They don't go to see 2 degrees of warming is going to potentially cause this impact in this town and this heating, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is where the kind of the IPCC report goes in. You know, it's great, and the language of even the final document from the UN about COP is full of pitfalls. You know, you can look at each word and what does it mean? You know, what does coal phase down and phase out mean? You know, it's complicated, and that should be okay. We should have this complicated bit. Those conversations need to happen, but, you know, that's maybe where climate misinformation doesn't have to deal with all the actual complexities. You can just stick to a narrative. You can jump on other narratives. The fact that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene are kind of jumping on this, he's a massive part of those conversations around Trump as well, and it all kind of blends in together because, you know, it's well, let's be honest, it's a lot easier to make up a story and make it seem more believable than it is to actually report on what's happening. But, you know, I think that's why Sweet Bobby is a great example of how we have this conversation, is because we've got a person at the front of it and you can tell that narrative and it says wider things about the ethics of it. So that was, you know, and it was maybe how we do that as journalists, is we take that lesson.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. Facebook have invested some money in their climate science fact-checking infrastructure. But the point you make about the power of stories, I think, is actually really the key, because a lot of these sort of climate misinformation narratives are just powerful stories, conspiratorial scientists, sort of evil left-wing politicians with no sort of regard for the economic impact of climate action. For Tortoise, I think the idea here will surely be to follow up with Stop Funding Heat and try and understand more about sort of what they want to research in future, and see if there's some way that we could collaborate. Thanks a lot, Phoebe. Tanish, it would be great to come back to you if you're there and ready to speak. Just I'm interested to hear your hi.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've actually been working on a report which I'm doing for one of my classes, which focuses on esports and women, and it's basically trying to look at why are there so few women in the esports space when any of the like natural sort of physical differences or difference in abilities don't present themselves when it comes to like gaming online competitively versus like playing football on the same field. And it's actually kind of shocking that I spoke to a player who's currently based in the UK, and she told me that a lot of the times it's just players don't treat women players as equally capable, and a lot of the sexism that maybe happens just is like, it's like the toxic sexism, like if she turns on the mic and like tries to engage in a collaborative game, like trying to talk with her team members, people will start asking her to go to the kitchen and stay there because she shouldn't be playing a game and stuff like that. And for me, heading into a metaverse that enables it, because at that point you can even, I don't know, this is a hypothetical possibility, but like you can change how you look, you can change how you talk, you can change almost every single aspect of your physical, like whatever appearance in the metaverse. And I think it just serves to exacerbate this kind of toxicity, especially because I'm assuming there would be some element of gaming involved, because it's just, it makes sense. And I'm just very concerned about that, even right now, simply because of the anonymity in esports. This is such a rampant issue. I'm just wondering, it has the potential to get worse.
Yeah,
that's a real concern for me.
Absolutely. That's a brilliant point, Tash. Thank you very much for weighing. It makes me think of two things. In fact, one is that we did a bit of reporting on the sort of the first announcement that Meta Platforms made of their rebrand, and I remember reading a commentator, I can't remember their name now, but they suggested that the metaverse would be a place where you could be stronger, better looking, wealthier, all sorts of things without any of the sort of ordinary limitations. And so it's just such an interesting idea how our kind of digital identities can become further and further removed from the reality. But also the point you make about how that could play into discrimination and the issue of treating people unfairly just on the basis of what their avatar looks like, perhaps. I just want to certainly get our heads around. Thanks a lot, Tanish. There was a story. The second story it made me think of is one about body image and abuse, particularly of young girls on Instagram. One of the major stories in the Facebook files that have sort of been working their way out from the Wall Street Journal over the past few weeks was about research that was known within Facebook that showed a high proportion of young women who used Instagram and experienced depression, anxiety, and concern of their body image could link those experiences back to Instagram. And I'm aware that my colleague Imi Harper, did some reporting on that, and I think spoke to some families or individuals who'd been personally affected. And I just wondered, Imi, if we could get your take on what Facebook had been doing and why it was so concerning.
Yeah, so we covered this story back when it came out in the press. I think the Wall Street Journal led on it, that these leaks started to come out called the Facebook files. And one of the reports, sorry, that's my Slack kicking off. One of the reports was that Facebook had been doing this internal research for 2 years, and they'd found that their app makes body image worse for teenage girls, as you said. Their research found it was harmful for a large proportion of young girls. And so we spoke to a man called Ian Russell, who is the father of Molly Russell, whose name you might be familiar with. She unfortunately took her own life back in 2017, just before she turned 15. And in the wake of her death, her father went on her Instagram and found this horrifying, really disturbing content that was being pushed into her Instagram feed, but also into her Pinterest feed as well, which clearly was having an impact on how she was feeling. And Pinterest continued, this is separate to Metaverse, but it's the same kind of thing. Pinterest continued to email Molly's email address for months after she had died, these really like graphic pieces of content. And even if you sort of say, you can sort of ban a specific hashtag and say, I don't want to see a content about eating disorders or whatever, the algorithm will still find a way to push this to the most vulnerable users. And one thing that's sort of worrying me is that Instagram are talking about Instagram for kids and this new app that they want to develop, because at the moment you have to be over the age of 13 to use Instagram. And I've read a little bit about it, like it's going to be ad free and whatnot, which I suppose is a good thing. But is this really an app that we need? And also, who is going to be writing the algorithms that are going into this Instagram for kids app? Is it the same people? Will they just copy whatever is used in their current, adult version of that app, and then will that translate? It's basically one big rabbit hole, and I just recommend a podcast by the New York Times. I think it's called Rabbit Hole, and it's all about how people get really deep into these rabbit holes online. And it's not just about self-harm, it can also be about misinformation or terrorism. But yeah, I'd really recommend that podcast as well.
Thanks a lot, Amy. I remember we covered that story, at least in part, and I think the one of the interesting things about the aftermath of that particular part of the Facebook files was that the stock price didn't really flutter. Actually, Facebook Inc. and now Meta platforms, they came through the revelations of the Facebook file, and I personally think that that's one of the most shocking, relatively unscathed. And I think there's a point to make at the top of this, I should have made maybe at the top of this, that there's a real resilience to Meta as a company, and they're worth $530 or so billion in total as net, and they've made extremely large amounts of profit and revenue in the past year. And something in that question you just asked, like what do we really need from a social media platform? What's desirable from it? And indeed, like what's the price that we're willing to pay, not in economic terms, but in terms of a cost to society to have these platforms keep running? There are loads of interesting observations in the chat, and I think one that I would really like to come to in a moment was from where? Oh, it was Chris Chadwick, who unfortunately said that he's not able to say. But so I'll give you a preview of tomorrow's Tech State Sense Maker, because it's a story that's very close to what Imi was just talking about. Which is a report that's found that Facebook haven't disabled the data collection functions that run on the accounts of children, so people who are under 18 using Facebook, and those systems function to collect the data to serve ads to children. It's called Facebook Apex, I think. And that system sucks up data that the company then use to infer things about you and serve you ads that they think you're most likely to engage with. An important bit of news from the company recently was that they had turned off the ability for advertisers to target children by anything other than their age, their gender, and their location. So they'd essentially said, oh, well, we won't let you target a child with an ad based on what TV shows they like, or what school they go to, or who their friends are. We'll only let you do a select amount of targeted advertising. But what that doesn't change is the sort of underlying system that amplifies content, including ads, for a given user based on what Facebook already know. And there's something you said, Imi, there about like the fact that once you were into a particular sort of pathway of content amplification, whether it was in something harmful or not, it gets more and more intense as the system sort of feeds itself and goes on and on. And that, to me, is something that we really need to pay close attention to. There are obviously bits of regulation coming out at the moment that are focused on different parts of online safety, whether it's in the UK or the EU, but for the most part, ads have been left out. So we're running that story tomorrow, and there's some interview content and questions answered by some of the people who are involved with the report. But But before we finish, I'd love to pick up on something that Seb has said. And I think there's a sort of general sense of questioning the purpose of Meta now, the purpose of innovating in the metaverse and what it would actually mean. So Seb, if you're there, it would be great to hear kind of like, do you want the metaverse to happen? Is it something that you're excited about, or is this sort of discussion about all the limitations and potential harms, does that put you off?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I think it's really interesting that what I was saying in the chat is just how vague it is. Like, I think they're keeping it as vague as possible to kind of build up hype. Like, you know, is this going to be this thing we can like plug into and live like a completely convincing experience of life and meet people and talk to people and, you know, like, is it going to feel like real life, or are we just going to put on some kind of headset and walk around and like type to people like existing VR? And like, I think they're being really vague about the timescale and the product that they're making, probably for a lot of reasons, like, you know, keep the hype up really high. No one really knows, and I doubt they really know. And then also avoid all the kind of questions we've been raising in the chat. And yeah, as to whether I'm excited or terrified, I think it kind of a good mix of both. I think there's some really interesting things about it, like the opportunities for kind of maybe disabled people or people who struggle to go outside for whatever reason. It kind of offers them a really interesting kind of space to meet people and way to interact with like some kind of world, but then also just absolutely terrifying in terms of like the product Facebook has right now and how it's basically destroying everything from democracy to relationships to everything. And the fact that this is just like infinitely more complex and poses so many more massive questions. Like, yeah, I don't know. I think it's more worrying than it is exciting. And I wonder how long they're going to keep it vague. And I kind of up until release, they'll keep it extremely vague what they're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting to think, will there ever actually be a moment where Facebook say, here's the metaverse, enjoy? Or is it something that's going to sort of more organically develop and there won't be, as you say, sort of a threshold moment? Michael Kowalski, it would be awesome to get you to make a relatively rare, but obviously important appearance in A Tortoise Thinking. There was a comment slightly further up that I haven't successfully scrolled back to, I think about changing our perception of reality. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on why sort of Facebook have put the timescale around the metaverse together so vaguely. What do you reckon?
Well, I think that it's not as though that they're planning on rolling out a metaverse product particularly. You know, this idea of a digital overlay on the real world that is available wherever you are is one that, you know, has been kicking around in tech for a little while and a lot of firms are working on. And certainly Apple are thought to be doing a lot of work on it, as you can see with their periodic augmented reality announcements. So I don't think there's a product here waiting to be released. I'm broadly kind of pro metaverse. I think there's lots of interesting opportunities around it. I think it's going to be an absolutely massive technology, as long as we are more cautious than we have been about rushing into these kinds of things in the past. Now, as I pointed out, like nobody, you know, almost the entire point of the metaverse is to be able to kind of customize your perception of reality. That little reality bubbles are not a bug; they're a feature. And yet, you know, if we look at Facebook, this kind of happened inadvertently, as you say, just through amplification loops. That we did end up hiving off into our own little bubbles of reality, and that wasn't even the intent. So there's obviously a lot of risk around this.
Yeah. It's interesting that actually that, for what you said there, as long as we're more cautious, that kind of takes us full circle, I think, to some of what Matt was saying at the top, which is essentially that there needs to be better sort of multi-part conversations between regulators, consumers, the developers of these platforms themselves, principally obviously for this thinking Meta, but Google, Amazon, Microsoft, as they all sort of, and Tencent, as they sort of venture into building these new digital worlds. I've been struck by a couple of things, and I think they are the things that Tortoise will have to look into further and will obviously be anticipating, talking about and thinking about as we go into next year with the tech states SenseMaker. But first and foremost, we've got to follow the online safety bill and the Digital Markets Act in the EU, as well as other legislation that emerges. And Matt's point about how that regulation should emerge as part of a conversation, I think is an important one. The collaboration between nations and jurisdictions that Liesl made as well, I think is an important point. We'll have to be looking out for where that type of sort of international coalition for monitoring social media platforms could emerge from. The outsourcing of moderating labor, I think, is extremely important and interesting. I was reminded of a story about content labelers working for TikTok being paid as little as 70 cents an hour, whilst they were locked into analyzing content in 100-hour blocks. And 100 hours of TikToks is not something you want to meet in a dark street kind of thing. So those types of conditions are obviously so important, and trying to work out where this labor is coming from and where human rights the protection of human rights has become an issue. Patricia's point about the metaverse and increasingly intense digital environments being a real risk factor around content like porn, problems of addiction and consent. And Tanish's point about how discrimination itself could morph and change and become more intense in a digital world that's sort of negotiated through avatars, and where we can step outside of the body that reality or physical reality has given us. That's about it. In that we've run out of time. Thanks to everyone who's weighed in. It's been really, really interesting for us. I will certainly put my head together with Alexi in the coming days to think about where we go with this, and do look out for the Tech State Sense Maker tomorrow morning. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you later.